The last one in the category of technical management practice areas is measurement and tracking. This is all about collecting information for the decision makers. So you probably have some sort of measurement program in place right now in your organizations. Whether it's formally recognized as a measurement program or not is another story. But I assume you're at least collecting data with respect to schedule and cost and time to develop, time to release, and so on. So some basic measures of overall effectiveness of an organization. And these are the kinds of things that you would also do in a product line context. It's just that you need to associate those kinds of measures with the aspects of product development or product line operation, particularly product development and core asset development, and measure the effectiveness of core assets contributions to product development. So a measurement activity in an organization is typically done in two phases. First of all, you figure out what it is we want to measure and why. So if your organization has a goal of faster time to market, okay, so how do we measure that? And who's interested in that information? And what are they going to do with it? And how do we collect that? At what points in the life cycle do we collect information or collect data that would support that? And then in the performance phase, you do it. So whatever the goals were set out, whatever people were identified as being the people collecting the metrics, and the process for feeding that information back to the people or set of people who are responsible for the roll-up of the data into information, they have to be identified and tasked to do this at various phases in the life cycle of a product line. And so you need to have measures at the core asset level, at the product development level, and some measures to gauge the overall effectiveness of the organization now that it has become a product line organization. So for example, the kinds of concerns that your product line manager will want to track are the overall efficiency of the organization with respect to the processes that are put in place to make it a product line organization, and the effectiveness of the core assets that are being shipped to product development in terms of saving development time or reducing the defects that are being found in products, reducing the testing time. So these are some of the high-level concerns at the product line manager level. Then the person in charge of core asset development should be keeping track of the quality of the core assets that are being released to product development and the usefulness of them. So if I've got a set of 10 core assets, let's say in my core asset base, and I find out that only 7 of them are being used across all the product development efforts, why aren't the other 3 being used? Did somebody in product development decide these are no good? Why? Are they not meeting the needs of those particular product development efforts? And if so, what happened? Why did we end up creating these assets that nobody uses? So the core asset development manager needs to keep track of things like that. The product managers will want to keep track of the quality of the products and be able to say whether or not a defect is associated with the actual product-specific part of the product or whether it's associated with the core asset. So there's an additional level of checking that you do in the core assets in the sense that you do quality checks on the core assets before you release them to product development. But then within product development, you have to be able to determine whether or not a defect is attributable to a core asset that somehow escaped the quality checks in core asset development, or the defect is attributable to the product-specific part. And what's the efficiency of product developers? Because the big promise of becoming a product line organization was, we're going to give you all these reusable assets, so it's going to save you a significant chunk of product development time and test and integration time and so on. So how will you know if you don't keep track of things like these? So the higher level goals, like increased profitability, for example, will decompose into lower level goals that can be operationalized in units doing core asset development and product development, for example. And so the measures collected at individual units and at different points in the life cycle will be rolled up at the product line level to see whether or not an organization has a quantitative assessment of the effectiveness of the product line approach. So some of these measures are, for example, which core assets are being used in which products. That will tell you whether or not core assets are actually useful to product development. So a simple check of, here are all the assets in the core asset base, which products are they being used in? So I said earlier that not every asset needs to show up in every product, but you need to have enough of a subset of those assets showing up in products to justify the expense of creating the core asset base in the first place. How many bugs have been discovered in core assets by the product developers? That might indicate a need for improving your defect tracking at the core asset level before releasing core assets to products. How much effort does it take to create a product over and above the effort required to incorporate the core assets into a product? Actually, in addition to the cost of creating product-specific components at product development level, there is a cost associated with finding an asset in the core asset base and then exercising the variation points to incorporate that into a particular product. The assumption is, if you have done your core asset job properly, that effort will be small. It will be easier to find the assets that meet the requirements of a particular product. It will be easy to tailor those assets to incorporate them into a product development effort. But as a sanity check, you should take some measures about how easy is it to find, how long does it take people to actually exercise variation mechanisms to incorporate an asset into a product. So that's one level of measurement. And then the other level of measurement is for the parts of a product that are not covered by the core asset base. How much time are people spending on that? And is there anything that we could do to reduce that burden? Maybe there is a case to be made for some of that going into the core asset base, particularly if that level of effort is showing up in other product development efforts. So somebody in the organization needs to be looking for those kinds of opportunities and tracking those in a quantitative way. So some basic measures for how are you going to gauge the success of your product line other than relying on anecdotal evidence from the product developers, or core asset developers. The GDSM approach, this is not specifically for product lines, but using a goal, this is based on the goal question metrics approach of Vic Basili. So it's not product line specific, but it has a lot of very good basic information such as what do you want to measure and why? Who's going to be responsible for measuring it? So all these kinds of things that you need to have in your initiation step when you're trying to figure out what it is you want to do and who's going to do it. So you need to choose those measures based on things of interest to core asset management, product management, and product line management. And you need to make sure that they are not so expensive and so burdensome to the people collecting those that they will bypass the whole measurement program because, well, we simply can't take these measures right now because we're in a test and integration crunch. So the effectiveness of the core asset, okay, we'll get to it later, and later never comes. So you can take some direct measurements like the time a core asset was baselined and placed in the core asset base. You can do some indirect measurements like how long it took people to create a core asset. That might give you an indication of either its complexity or maybe even the skill level or lack of it of the people creating it. You can do some subjective measures like customer satisfaction, not just from external customers but from your internal consumers of the core assets. And you can do some derived measures like the the cost of a product or a core asset as a function of its size and a function of the cost of the developer's time. So, at some point people are going to ask you to quantify product line success. And that means you need to be able to come up with at least some numbers to justify, well, we said we were going to reduce defects, improve quality, improve time to market. Did you really? Well, we think we did. Well, show me the numbers. Well, we didn't collect them. Or we have some numbers, but they're really based on a combination of both hardware and software, so we can't really factor out the software costs. So we can't really tell you the contribution of software to the overall schedule improvement or slippage, as the case may be. There has also been some work done on measure-based reuse models in some of the earlier reuse work. Things like measuring the cost of developing for reuse and the cost of developing with reuse. And earlier I said how the cost of developing for reuse, making artifacts reusable, is anywhere from 2 to 3 times more expensive than just doing it as a one-off. So there needs to be some projections then made based on the cost of developing with reuse that would show savings. And these are typically done in terms of percentages of effort saved or lines of code. Our old friend line of code is still around as a measurement. Some of the risks in this, if you don't do a good job of this, not only will you have wasted time and resources setting up a measurement program that nobody uses, but it also has an opportunity cost in the sense that you could have been doing something else that actually was useful. You also have a potential for wrecking the product line concept within the organization forever. Because if people don't really see the benefits of it and can't quantify it, or your attempts to quantify it are so burdensome on the organization, product lines will get a bad name and people will never try product lines again. The other risk is that you do collect the information, but it really doesn't provide the kinds of decision-making information that management needs to be able to make strategic changes in direction or broadening the scope, for example. So you're not collecting the kinds of information necessary to support an ongoing product line effort. Some of the causes of this are there's a mismatch between what you are trying to measure and the measures that you are actually collecting. So you're really collecting, as I said, for example, all your software and hardware costs are bundled together, and you're trying to come up with measures for the effectiveness of software core assets, and you simply can't tell on the basis of what you're collecting. If you have goals that have no measures associated with them, you have no way to gauge the effectiveness of those other than via anecdotal evidence. If the measurement is not aligned with the significant life cycle stages of a product line, so when you finally place a baseline core asset in the core asset base, that's a good time to collect some measures for how long did it take, how much did it cost before it gets
gathering part of the process.
Pardon?
Make it part of the process that you're doing anyway.
Yeah. And in fact, part of the job of creating a core asset is not just creating the asset and coming up with a so-called attached process for how to use that asset. But part of the job of the core asset creators is to come up with candidate measures for how somebody would gauge the effectiveness of this. If the measures are too costly, if the data is too burdensome to collect, or you're trying to collect it at inappropriate times in the life cycle, that's a risk that whatever numbers you get will not inform the decision makers. And if you collect measures that are supposed to influence the decision making, but no actions are planned, so even if the measures show a problem, but the problem is ignored, then why did you bother collecting the measures in the first place? And the last bullet there refers to the fact that even if you do have a measurement program in place and you are getting accurate numbers, don't rely solely on the numbers, and this brings into play the experience of your product line manager. If, for example, you are trying to move into a relatively new area where that person has an instinct that this is the right thing to do, the numbers alone may not show enough of a justification to do it. But that person has been through this kind of thing before and sees some real potential here. So despite the fact that the numbers are saying one thing, he or she has the experience and the instinct that this is still the right thing to do. So they're not relying solely on just what the numbers say. And these are some references. The last one there refers to a paper that was put together by a couple of people working in both the product line arena and the SEI software measurement arena. So they've come up with a starter set of measures for a product line effort, some of which you have seen here in this module. So a quick question. People often talk about we have a certain time to market, and if we're going to improve how we develop software, whether or not it's a product line, we need to shorten the time to market. We need to get products out the door faster. Is that a term that's used in your organization? Time to deploy. Okay, so that's an equivalent term. Something has to be out and in the field. So if you want to improve the time to deployment, well, that suggests that there's an end point at which the product is deployed. There's a start point at which what? Because if you're talking about shortening this time to deployment, what are we talking about shortening? What are the start and the end points? We've got an end point. You have a definition for the start point. Is it when the product is first conceived of as a product, or is it when the funding is turned on to create that product? Okay, so product approval, that's the start, and the end is the actual deployment. And so when we talk about, for example, if the goal of a product line effort is to shorten the time to deployment, you would be able to look back at a historical set of data for this time period, and you would be able to compare that against what you're collecting for the product line effort to know quantitatively whether or not the deployment is actually being shortened. Yeah. The reason we ask this question is not to come up with a definition of time to market. It's just that time to market is something that's very often touted as one of the goals of a product line, shortening time to market. But if what you're shortening is a moving quantity, or if the information that you've collected from previous efforts is based on different start and end points. So for some organizations, the beginning point is when the product is first conceived. For others, it's when it's approved. For others, it's when the funding is finally allocated. And the end point might be factory acceptance test before it leaves the producing organization. For others, it's the on-site customer acceptance test. And so if you have various measures associated with this shifting quantity, and now you're making claims for your product line that we're going to shorten this quantity, how can anybody believe you? So the whole point of a measurement program is to be able to come up with realistic projections for the future based on known quantitative results from the past. And if you don't have those from the past, it's going to be hard to make projections for the future. That was our tour through a subset of the technical management practice areas.